You're listening to Time to Talk with Tim and Megs. Well, Australia's COVID vaccine rollout is expected to be completed by the end of October 2021. There are two principles underpinning this operation. One, it will be free, and two, it will be totally voluntary. High-risk groups will be given priority over 70s, and frontline workers will likely get the vaccine first in Australia, with approval for the Pfizer vaccine expected to be given in March. But Megs, this is the part that I found really interesting. I wanted to learn a little bit more about the potential downsides to a mass vaccination, or just a personal vaccination as well. And when I went for a little bit of a cruise around the internet, it was astoundingly difficult to find any literature on the case against vaccination.
Yeah, no, definitely. I didn't find any either.
And that's strange, because I've looked up anti-vaccination material before COVID, and there was ample. There was plenty out there, plenty of sites you could go to and,
stating the case,
making the informed choice. But now it seems to be a blackout. And, of course, Peter Evans, famous for one of those cooking shows on TV, he was shut down from Facebook recently for suggesting COVID was nothing more than a common cold. And I just want to make this clear before we get into this conversation. I will most likely get the jab. I want nothing more than for COVID just to go away, to get lost, to leave us alone. I am not an anti-vaxxer. However, I do keep an open mind. I like to make informed choice. Equally, I've been extremely passionate forever about freedom of speech and informed choice. There are plenty of views out there in the community that I find astoundingly absurd, possibly just wrong, but I've always fundamentally believed that people have the right to say what they need to say. They have the right to believe what they need to believe. And, of course, there's a Pandora's box of exceptions to that principle, one of those being public safety.
Yeah.
So today, Megs, we're joined by Meryl and Anita. They represent the group called Australian Vaccination Risks Network. G'day, Meryl and Anita.
Hi, thanks for having us on.
Hi there, Tom.
It's great to have you both on the show. Thanks for coming on. Hey, Meryl, I was surprised, but I'm supposing that you're not, that it was so hard to find information on the internet. You know, the internet, the source of all information. It's so hard to find information about the case against vaccination.
Yeah, it's the internet of everything except when it comes to any subject that certain corporate interests or government interests or medical interests want to hide. And I liked what you said about freedom of speech, because the AVN, the organization that Anita and I work with, agree with that 100%. You only have freedom of speech if the people who you disagree with have freedom of speech. And right now we're in a situation where we're being told that the only people who are allowed to have free speech or an opinion on this issue are those who support the government and the medical community's position on vaccination. That's simply censorship and tyranny.
Would you say it has been an active campaign to shut down the information off the internet? Because I wouldn't have thought that was particularly easy to do. But then I look at people on Facebook, quite a few people setting up second and third accounts on Facebook and then putting posts up saying, oh, look, I was taken off because I had said something against vaccination or something against COVID or something about, attending a gathering. So Facebook are actively doing this. Is this an active campaign?
It is not only active, it is blatant. The heads of Twitter, Facebook, and several other social media outlets have stated publicly that they will stop anyone from questioning vaccination against COVID. And they're not even saying anti-vaccine, because our organization is not anti-vaccine. We simply believe that there needs to be the right to know all information and make a free choice. And what people like Zuckerberg and Jack, I forget his name, from Twitter, and all these other major social media outlets have said is, you do not have the right to say anything on our platform.
Your group is called the Australian Vaccination Risks Network. And I note that you said there that you're not against vaccination. You'd just like informed choice to be made. Vaccinations inherently come with risk, don't they? And the problem is, as I went trying to explore what those risks specifically are, don't get me wrong, I ended up finding information, but I had to dig a little bit harder than what you'd expect. But there are risks with mass vaccination against COVID.
if you look at the swine flu outbreak, well, supposed outbreak in the USA in 1976, and the resulting mass vaccination with the swine flu vaccine, there was resulting thousands of cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome. There were hundreds of cases of deaths, although that has been scrubbed from a lot of places on the internet now too. If you go back to the original 60 Minutes program that covered that, you can still find that on YouTube. In the USA, you can find out what really happened there. And those people were all told that that vaccine was safe and effective, and the results were catastrophic, and they had to cancel the program. In 2009, we had the swine flu outbreak in Australia, and resulting from that, there was a vaccine developed called Fluvax, which was released in 2010. It was also a pandemic vaccine, so it had very little testing. And that resulted in the hospitalisation of hundreds of children in WA and resulted in the permanent brain damage to toddler Saba Button. So, in the same year there was Pandemrix. It was a pandemic vaccine released in Europe, and it caused an outbreak of narcolepsy, and there were many lawsuits over that. And all those vaccines, we were told, were safe and were effective. So it's only when these experimental vaccines are released onto the widespread public do we see what their full effects really can be, and it's not in a study setting. So, there can absolutely be risks with the COVID vaccine. It's experimental technology, it's mRNA technology, which we won't know the effects until they do start this mass vaccination campaign. So to bully people into getting it or to ridicule people for questioning it, people obviously have no sense of history or risk about vaccination.
Anita, can all of the information you just provided there be referenced?
Absolutely. I can give you links to that after the program if you'd like. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that'd be great, because what we'll do, Anita, is we'll put the links into the description of this podcast so that people can, because I can imagine, people are very cynical about this. The word anti-vaxxer is thrown around in quite a derogatory way. So what I'd like to do is make sure that everything that we're saying, people can go and look for themselves. And just on that idea that the COVID vaccine, particularly the Pfizer one, is experimental, your word that you used there, I did manage to find a bit of information about it that I'll read out here. So I want to talk about the actual safety and efficacy that they themselves, the company Pfizer, have put out. Approximately 37,000 people were included in the trial's safety analysis. Half received 2 doses of the vaccine, the other half a saline placebo injection. Importantly, the vaccine was tested in people at higher risk from COVID-19. Just over 40% of the participants were over 55 years old, about 1/3 were overweight, and another third were obese. They included people in the trials who had pre-existing conditions such as diabetes, pulmonary disease, and HIV. They were also included. They did not test, as is common practice apparently, women who were pregnant. They had people from, majority of the participants were in the United States. However, there were people in the trial who were also from Argentina, Brazil, South Africa. The safety profile of the vaccine was proven to be good across different ages, ethnicities, both sexes, and including individuals with pre-existing diseases. Some participants reported some side effects after being immunised, such as headaches, fatigue, or pain at the injection site. I'm curious to know, with the group that you represent, do you feel like proper testing has been done on these vaccines? Because it's easy to say it hasn't, but when you go looking, it looks like they've put these through some, even though very short time frames, admittedly, but it looks like they've put them through some pretty vigorous testing.
First of all, saying that there was a saline placebo in this trial is not accurate. There may have been some groups, some small groups that did receive a saline placebo, but the majority of the placebo, and you can't see me, but I'm putting that in inverted commas, group got another vaccine, and there were deaths in both groups. They were not transparent about what they actually did use, except we do know that the meningococcal vaccine was used in some of the pre-licensure trials. And I have to say that this vaccine has not been licensed in the United States. It's been authorized under emergency authorization. And if it is as safe as we've been told, then the pharmaceutical companies should be accepting responsibility for any damage. But Pfizer, Moderna, all the other vaccine manufacturers who have worked on this vaccine have said that the only way they will release it and sell it to the governments is if they are fully indemnified against any responsibility, financial or otherwise. In addition, it was tested for such a short period of time. You need to have a randomized controlled trial of any drug or vaccine using an inert placebo over a long period of time and start with animal studies. The animal studies were skipped completely. In the previous coronavirus vaccine trials for SARS in 2003, the reason that vaccine was not released is they tested it in ferrets first and the ferrets died. So they did not release the vaccine. We've skipped that completely with the coronavirus vaccines. The science is simply not there to show that this vaccine is either safe or effective. And even the manufacturers have said that being vaccinated may not prevent you from either catching or transmitting coronavirus.
However, though, it has been authorized by the US Food and Drug Administration, and a lot of people have taken it and been fine, and it's been successful. And it does sound like the study was very thorough, though. So
it's interesting, though, Megs, because I'm thinking about it, and by the end of this trial, there are 19,000 vaccinated individuals, right? I don't know. I'm not a scientist at all, but in my common sense brain, I'm thinking, can you take, even if that was overwhelmingly successful, as they claim it was, can you extrapolate that to say it's going to be successful in millions of people around the world?
You never can, but like we've had so many successes with vaccines before, like with smallpox, with all sorts of disease, polio. And so to distrust vaccines per se, like just vaccines in general, and because we don't know what will happen in the future, it sort of neglects the fact that we trust a lot of vaccines that have done great good.
Meryl and Anita, do you distrust vaccines in general?
Me personally, yes, I do. And you're mentioning smallpox there and polio there. I mean, if you actually delved into the history of smallpox and polio vaccines, you might want to do that. Smallpox was actually made rampant by the vaccination campaigns. Yes, it has, but that was due to other factors than smallpox. The vaccine was actually very deadly, and if you looked up an uprising in Leicester in England in, I think it was the late 1800s, where people revolted and refused to get the vaccine and got rid of smallpox by improving their hygiene and all those sorts of things, like public health sanitation measures is what happened. And with polio, you might want to look into the history of poliomyelitis. Originally, it wasn't called polio and is as in one disease. It was called a poliomyelitis, as in you had a paralytic kind of set of symptoms and they weren't sure what caused it. But if you looked in the New England area in America, that was some of the original cases, and it was a lot of children went down sick after eating fresh fruit. Animals were affected as well. So a lot of early cases of poliomyelitis were actually from pesticides like calcium arsenate and lead arsenate, which were widespread use for the codling moth at that time. And if you got further on, a lot of cases of polio were caused by DDT up to the 1950s. If you look at the congressional records in the USA, there was actually doctors testifying in Congress saying, you need to look at this. It's actually poisoning. It's not a virus. So, you know, there's a lot of different things that went on there, and they actually changed the definition of polio after the vaccine came out. And, of course, if you look up the Cutter incident, that actually killed and paralyzed children. One lab put out a vaccine that wasn't properly inactivated. It wasn't treated with enough formaldehyde. And, you know, there were deaths and paralysis from the vaccine itself. But as I say, they changed the definition of polio. Prior to the vaccine, you only had to have the paralytic type symptoms for 24 hours. After that, you had to have them for 30 days. And they changed it to things like aseptic meningitis or acute flaccid paralysis. So it was actually got rid of it by definition alone. And there is actually a lot of what would once have been called polio in the world now, but it's not called polio anymore. And, you know, though there aren't iron lungs, but there are certainly ventilators. And if you see outbreaks of polio-like illness in children in the USA every year, and it's always in vaccinated children. So I know you guys said you don't know a lot about science and you're not scientists, but I really implore that you look into a lot of these things and don't just dismiss them. And I know you think you might know the history you've been told, but honestly, once you peel back the layers, it's astonishing what you find.
we're presented with a global issue here of COVID-19. If we're not looking to vaccine as the hope, what are we looking to?
Well, the science on hydroxychloroquine, the science on ivermectin, I have to say that the censorship on those two things is nothing like I've ever seen before. I don't know if you saw America's frontline doctors. I mean, you've got frontline doctors, physicians out there saying, you know, we're having great success with hydroxychloroquine, we're having great success with ivermectin, and they are being censored left, right and centre. I've never seen anything like it. Videos disappear while you're watching them. And, you know, these are not some, you know, tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorists. These are frontline doctors treating patients, and their views aren't even being allowed. And I mean, if you share their views on Facebook, you're told it's been fact-checked, which is another word for censored. So it's truly incredible. You know, there are, but see, if there is an alternative cure or treatment for these things, then the FDA can't give emergency use to the vaccination, which has always seemed to be the way they want to go. So it's been truly incredible. And, you know, we're always told to be locked inside, stressed, you know, basically watching TV when we should be out getting sunshine, fresh air, vitamin D. You know, we should be having social contact with people. You know, love and all those things are very important. Isolation is very dangerous and very deadly for people. We know this. So, you know, it's kind of the worst case scenario if these people in the aged care homes, these elderly people are locked up on their own. They're terrified. They're often not fed very high quality food. So it's a recipe for disaster all round. Last week, a coroner in the US came out saying she had gunshot victims, but they were put down as COVID deaths because they tested positive after, you know, at autopsy, even though they had died from gunshot wounds. So, you know, you've got those statistics, and even with all those added things padding out the statistics, according to the government, COVID's still not very deadly anyway. Like, it is like a bad flu season. So, you know, it's incredible that you would shut down the world, you would go on a mass vaccination campaign with goodness knows what outcomes for people. And, you know, it's just truly incredible that this is where we're at. But as I said, you know, there are a lot of options out there, and you never see the government out there saying what to do to improve your health. It's always stress and fear and stress and fear, and that is the worst thing you can do.
Is it fair of me to say, though, that you're more anti-censorship than anti-vaccine? Because you did bring up doctors and said that these are doctors, you know, medical experts that are supporting hydroxychloroquine or whatever it's called.
Hydroxychloroquine, yeah.
Would it be fair to say that if the Pfizer vaccine, like the Pfizer vaccine is also supported by doctors and medical experts, right? So if that had been censored, maybe you'd be concerned about that instead of the one that you're saying might have some merit. And so maybe you're more following what's being shut down more than what the science is saying.
Well, we just want sunlight on everything. That's all we've really asked for, is just let all the information go out there. Let everyone have all the information. People are intelligent. They can work things out. I mean, for years at the AVN, Merrill has had a standing invitation to any doctors, to any scientists around Australia to have this debate, whether you call it a vaccination science debate, vaccination safety debate, you know, live on television. We present our side, if you will, our information. They present theirs, and people can judge for themselves what information they want.
There are times where, particularly during times of crisis, which you could argue we are in now, where you don't want to muddy the waters, where you don't want to confuse people. For example, if there was an emergency happening in a school, you show them the way. You have your ushers, you roll out your plan immediately, and you say, this is the direction to safety. This is one voice of safety. You don't want three voices of safety in there because that can cause more harm. That's the argument here. Is there any merit to that argument, Anita or Merrill, that we can't muddy the waters at such a critical time with 10 different perspectives on such a serious issue?
Well, I do hate that analogy. I hate analogies, but I'm going to go with you on that. Say the emergency in that school was that there was a gunman on that campus, okay? And you just had one teacher that was in charge of getting those children to safety, but they were lacking the information of where the gunman was. And they speared all those children straight into the path of the gunman because they didn't know where they were located. Mm-hmm. What if there was another person on scene who had the information of where that gunman was and could get that information and get that information to the teacher that was shepherding all those children? Would you not want that person to pass on that information and avoid tragedy?
We need the most informed information possible in an emergency.
Exactly. You need to be well informed. You need to have all the facts.
Adults.
And it's all well and good to be directed off a cliff.
And we need to trust adults to make decisions about their own families. When it comes down to it, if a vaccine is safe or unsafe, it is not the government, and it is not, in this case, the pharmaceutical company who is going to bear the cost. It is going to be the individual. All we are saying is we need to be able to have the information, emergency or no emergency. That does not abrogate the government's responsibility to inform us openly and without bias. And right now they are doing neither of those things. They are incredibly biased, and they are completely untransparent, opaque. So we really can't do this. When it is our lives and our families we are talking about, we bear the ultimate responsibility.
I take it that you both would be quite against the lockdown measures that have been taken in certain parts of the country as well?
Absolutely.
I'm in favor of science, and there is nothing in science that shows that masks are effective at preventing the spread of an infectious illness or a virus. There is nothing in science that shows that locking down the healthy in any way protects anyone. And the idea of being ordered to lock down is completely undemocratic, and we are big supporters of democracy. If you as an individual are concerned and think that you are at risk, don't go out. Sorry.
But in Australia, we've done an excellent job of keeping the spread down, and a big part of that is through social distancing and through keeping people away from each other, at least when cases are nearby. And so don't you think that, science would say, it's just statistically that we've managed to cram down the cases by ensuring that there's minimal, transmission of the COVID-19?
You're talking about cases. Now, cases, by definition, never before in the history of science have we determined that a person had an illness simply by testing asymptomatic people. We have always tested people before who had symptoms. The test that we are using has been shown to be incredibly inaccurate. There is something called cycles that they cycle the actual test. Anything over 35 cycles is considered to be totally ineffective. Our tests are cycled at 45 cycles or higher. And based on that, almost every single positive that comes through will be a false positive. That is according to scientists who are pathologists and who study this.
I love the fact that you say you rely on the science, because when it came to masks, I looked into this a while ago because I spoke to somebody who was quite cynical about masks some months ago. And there is science to back up the fact that masks work. There are studies that have been done, many, many studies.
I would love to see one of those studies, because the ones that I have seen all show that masks can be counterproductive in cases such as this, that they actually hold bacteria in. There are increasing numbers of cases of golden staph infections, pneumonia, all of this linked with the use of masks.
I'll read one to you.
Sure.
It might be one of those things where there's, science contradicting its own science. I mean, that's always possible. Sometimes you get studies that stand in conflict with each other. But one study published in Health Affairs, for example, it compared the COVID-19 growth rate before and after masks were mandated in 15 states in the District of Columbia, United States. It found that mask mandates led to a slowdown in daily COVID-19 growth rate, which became more apparent over time. The first 5 days after a mandate, the daily growth rate slowed by 0.9 percentage points compared to the 5 days prior to the mandate. And at 3 weeks, the daily growth rate had slowed by 2 percentage points. And there are lots of other studies too. There's 3 or 4 that I've got at my fingertips. It's interesting because you say you rely on the science, and I like to do that too. What are the facts? What can we look at? What's the evidence? But sometimes, I don't know, the science conflicts.
Yeah,
makes
all
it difficult
the time.
for the common
And if you
man.
look at Sweden never mandated masks. The masks were not used widely in Sweden, and they did not experience the great. They had a spike in deaths at the very beginning, but if you look at the Swedish experience, it's actually better than the experience in other countries that did mandate lockdowns, that did mandate masks. So you're right, there are conflicts, and it needs to be examined.
What would you both like to see happen from this point? I mean, what, for example, is it about having a huge website that everyone knows about, where you can go and look at column A, which talks about the science only, not the opinions, the science in favour of vaccines, and then column B that has the science, which expresses some of the concerns about the vaccines? What needs to happen besides conversations like this? Quite frankly, more of these are needed. What needs to happen?
Well, just end the censorship. I mean, like if you see Facebook, I don't know if you've heard of a program called The High Wire with a man named Del Bigtree, but he was recently removed from Facebook, and his show is huge. He was getting 1.5 million views a week, and he is all about the science. If you guys like science, I highly recommend you check out his program. He was actually a producer on the television program The Doctors in America for many years, and now he's turned to hand to vaccination science. And if Facebook and co, if there just was no censorship, that would do us. I mean, yes, it would be great if the government or someone, if there was just one portal where you could just go and it was just a mecca of science. I hate to say on both sides, but just all the science. But I mean, we would just be happy with a lack of censorship and open debate. Let us be on television and talk to people, or have scientists and doctors who are talking about the other opposing side of this on television. You're just not. Instead of even, they're not even allowed to speak online. It's just incredible that I've never seen so many highly credentialed researchers and doctors silenced. So just get rid of the censorship. I know our Facebook page, the shadow banning has been incredible. We went from thousands of views on our videos to in mid-November it just cut off. We now are lucky to have a couple of hundred views on any of our videos now. So it's truly incredible.
I would like to see all penalizing and demonizing of parents who make choices not to vaccinate to go out the window. No jab, no pay, no jab, no play. Any mention of mandating vaccines or mandating any form of compliance with government vaccination policies, that has no place in a scientific debate.
I was just going to say, I've had many before, and my friends have had many before, and we've all been fine every time. So that's been my experience.
Anita, you must hear that a lot.
They're very heavily accredited by the Australian government, like thousands of clinical trials, and they save 3 million lives a year.
Well, let Anita respond to that. You must hear that a lot, Anita, from people like Megs here who are saying, look, I've been vaccinated and nothing's gone wrong for me, and all my friends and family have been vaccinated, nothing's gone wrong for us.
I hear the opposite. Because I'm in this community, I have dozens of friends whose children were killed by vaccines. That's not making it I have dozens of friends literally whose children have been killed by vaccines. I have hundreds of friends whose children have been permanently disabled or their lives ruined forever by vaccines. I mean, in the US, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program has paid out over $4 billion to vaccine injury victims. And I mean, it was started in 1986 because the drug companies said, if you don't protect us from liability, we won't make any more vaccines. So the government in the USA gave the drug companies full liability protection and formed the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. So now you could no longer sue drug companies in the US, the country where you can sue anyone for anything. Drug companies cannot be sued for damages caused by their vaccine. And that's where we're at over there. I mean, in Australia, they keep telling us how wonderful vaccines are. You say thousands of studies. I'd like to see your reference for that. The TGA does not do any studies in Australia. They only get the manufacturer's information. The TGA in Australia does not do any independent study. So think about that if that was a car or any other product and you only had the manufacturer's word that product was safe and wonderful. There was no independent testing whatsoever. And when complaints came back, they were summarily ignored, which is what tends to happen in Australia. The only reason there was attention brought to the flu vax debacle in 2010 was because it injured so many children so very, very quickly.
I will be fascinated to see how long this lasts up on the internet. It'll be interesting to see. This is a bit of a test case for me. It's a bit of a test case.
And I fully agree that the marketplace ideas is important and the best ideas will win, and that's how we should do it. We shouldn't have the government step in and say which ideas are permissible or anything like that. Although I do think that it's important that information is accurate and that it doesn't do damage. because that's a very real risk.
Yeah, I know, and that's the fine line that we walk, even in conversations like this. But look, the information that Meryl and Anita have put forward today, I'm going to have a link to all of that in the description so people can click and again make that informed choice for themselves. Maybe word themselves up in a side of the debate, if you want to call it that you haven't actually read before. It would be interesting for us to go and check it out too. Meryl and Anita, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
All right.
Take care.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Thanks. Bye-bye.